As 1986 rolled in and the second half of the decade was in full steam, horror was still chugging along with many of the things that it had been doing since the first day of 1980. You had slashers and sequels, sometimes at the same time, and some of the genre's best directors were still churning out classics that we look back on almost 40 years later with reverence. While the Ramiros, Carpenters, and Cravens of the world are spoken about with an almost foreboding amount of respect, let's not forget about some of the other ones. David Cronenberg had already cemented himself in the world of horror with movies like Rabid, The Brood, Videodrome, and The Dead Zone. In 1986, 3 years after The Dead Zone, he would give us one of the greatest remakes of all time. On today's episode of 80s Horror Memories, it's time to be afraid. Be very, very afraid. And jump into the body horror masterpiece that is The Fly.
Be afraid. Be very afraid.
One of the most original directors in the horror genre has got to be David Cronenberg. He's just, what a twisted imagination, and he's not afraid to go to the dark places.
While John Carpenter's The Thing is widely regarded as one of the greatest horror movies and remakes of all time, it took quite some time to get there. The Fly, on the other hand, had a very successful box office, critical praise, and an Academy Award to its name at the following year's ceremony. While it's a remake of the 1958 classic starring Vincent Price, it's also a different adaptation of the short story released the same year by French-British author George Langlin.
I actually prefer the original Fly, marginally for different, they're very different movies. And that was, there were a couple of remakes that were made during the 80s that were my definition of a good remake. In other words, they completely reimagined the original movie in the source material. They didn't try to copycat it, they didn't try to duplicate it, and The Fly is certainly an example of that.
In terms of Cronenberg's catalog, The Fly sits in an interesting position as it may not be the first thing that people would go to. Newer audiences may think of his prestige movies like Eastern Promises or A History of Violence, while the old school will cite his earlier works like Scanners or Videodrome as his high watermarks. In terms of body horror, though, The Fly delivers on multiple fronts. The movie opens with a booming and whimsical piece from the score by eventual Oscar winner Howard Shore. While the cast is introduced in front of a very science-y background, one name that you won't see is producer Mel Brooks. Yes, that Mel Brooks. While the comedy legend made classic comedies as an actor and director, he also produced some surprising films like The Fly and the David Lynch-directed The Elephant Man.
I think The Fly is another example of people going through changes and not understanding what's happening to us as it's happening.
We see a party where Jeff Goldblum's Seth Brundle is chatting up Gina Davis's Veronica Caffe about how his new invention will change the world. Seeing this as a much younger man, I didn't really care about the burgeoning love story between this confident, attractive journalist and this overly smart but nerdy and self-conscious scientist.
Cronenberg is always looking to do something interesting and pushing the boundaries. I know that people have said that it's about the AIDS epidemic and that it's about how you have a relationship with somebody who's sick and dying. And those things are true irrespective of whether it's about AIDS or not. I think that's what makes that movie so compelling, is that it is about a relationship with someone who is sick and or dying and or changing.
I was here for the gore, because my older brother had shown me the exploding head scene from Scanners, and I knew that this was from the same director.
You ever see that scene in Scanners when that dude's head blew up?
I did identify with Brundle in the nerdy aspect, and so it was cool to eventually see Ronnie fall for him after spending some time together. This was a movie that if you caught on TV, like I did early on, you would be grossed out by the body horror that took place. When you saw the uncut version though, you were probably uneasy enough to yearn for that toned down TV cut. The movie starts out as a good throwback to 1950s science fiction, with character development and a score that matches exactly what the melodrama on screen is presenting. It also has a very science fiction-y plot. Seth is working on a teleporter contraption that is very hush-hush and under the radar. He uses multiple departments to build various things that he needs, but no one in the science community knows what he's working on. This presents a problem with Veronica's chosen profession, but her boss, Stathis Barans, which is a top 10 name of all time, thinks Brundle is all talk. Stathis is really the villain of the movie. Sure, he decides to help Ronnie near the end of the film, but he's incredibly selfish, and a lot of the decisions that he makes lead to the unfortunate problems that Seth and Veronica run into. He also has some of the best lines of the movie, with him showing up in her shower saying that he was feeling scummy.
What are you doing in my apartment?
Just happened to be in the neighborhood. Felt a bit scummy.
This is also about as literal and figuratively accurate as a character can get. The teleporter works, but with only inorganic material. Seth has unfortunately killed a few animals already by the time that Veronica starts to help him with his experiments, and becomes romantically involved with him. He tries to send part of a steak through, and when it comes out, he cooks it and figures out that the teleport pods and computer are just merely recreating a synthetic version of the organic material, rather than just moving it from one pod to the next. After saying that computers are dumb and only know what you program them to know, Seth teaches the correct science to the machine and sends the brother of one of the baboons he turned inside out through, but this time he is successful. The baboon is very friendly looking and loving on screen, but apparently it was quite the opposite. While all the actors do a great job, I remember the dialogue from the script is surprisingly funny, real, and with just a dash of noir to it. Lines like Stathis feeling scummy or Ronnie mentioning that she still has some residue of a former life that needs to be scraped off adds a little bit of flavor. And lines like these are peppered throughout the entire film.
I still have the residue of another life, you know. I have to scrape it off my shoe and get rid of it once and for all.
While certain parts of the movie were improvised or added by Goldblum and Davis, the bulk of the script was written by Cronenberg and Charles Edward Pogue. Pogue doesn't have nearly the pedigree that his director has, but he did give us the screenplay for Psycho 3 and Dragonheart, in addition to The Fly, so we love him here. His script was extensively rewritten by Cronenberg, who had an agreement to make whatever changes that he wanted, but many important aspects were kept. Makeup effects artist Chris Wallace was no stranger to Cronenberg, having worked in the makeup department in Scanners and on big-name movies like Gremlins, Return of the Jedi, and Raiders of the Lost Ark. That last one is extra evident when Brundlefly melts Stathis' hand in the climax of the movie. It looks nearly identical to the Nazi High Command melting after the Ark of the Covenant is opened at the end of that movie. Wallace went on to work on Arachnophobia and House 2, but was also chosen to be the director for the sequel to The Fly, which came out 3 years later in 1989. I don't think you'll be seeing us cover that one. Everyone knew the special effects were something incredible, but it was after the first few screenings that the crew knew it was better than they had ever expected it to be.
Chris Wallace knocked it out of the park. The effects for The Fly are just tremendous. Watching Jeff Goldblum's transformation from man to hybrid fly creature was, you couldn't look away. It was horrifying and incredible at the same time.
Ronnie runs off to confront Stathis after he sends a mock-up of the Brundle story being blown up after she promised him she would wait. And Seth gets drunk, emotional, and jealous, which leads to him hopping in the teleporter himself. We see what he doesn't, and a fly is spliced within his own genes. This begins the body horror aspect of the film. It really starts at the very beginning, with Seth being somewhat uncomfortable in his own skin. It continues with the slow change to his body that makes him feel like an altogether different kind of outsider. At first, he feels like he's on the outside looking in within the community. And then, after his molecular transformation, he feels like he's the only one in the world that feels that good.
Another image that I can't get out of my head from The Fly is when he's like doing acrobatics, swinging around a bar in his bedroom or his like loft area. And he's like, I feel great, and he's having sex like one boom after another. It's all like, where's this fly DNA I can inject? You know, we were all asking that question.
He tries to get Ronnie first, and then a girl from the local bar to go through the teleporter, but they both refuse. And on the other end of the spectrum is what Ronnie feels when she becomes pregnant. Yes, you heard that right. Carrying a child can be terrifying in its own responsibility, and a body horror in the way that it forever changes the mother's body. But with the unknown growing in her after we find out that Brundle isn't 100% human anymore, that is horrifying. There's body horror, and then there's body horror. And this movie doesn't shy away from any of it. From the moment that Seth rolls over on a computer chip, which is a foreshadowing of the flesh mixed with the machine that we would get at the end of the movie, to the mercy killing of the Brundle fly. The film is packed with gross out horror that sticks with you long after the film ends. The coarse hairs that grow from Seth's back seem harmless at first, but when they come back as insect DNA, his transformation really begins. From eating seemingly only sugar, to having speed dominate every aspect of his life. The noticeable physical tics are great storytelling before his body starts to really fail him. It has to be said that Goldblum's performance is incredible.
You know, The Fly I think, works so well, not just because of Cronenberg's sense of body horror and his approach towards humanity and the loss of humanity, but because of Goldblum. Jeff Goldblum's performance is amazing. He is riveting to watch. Everything he does in that film is mesmerizing.
I may not have remembered exactly what went on between every character in the movie, but I always remembered his fingernails falling off and him squeezing his swollen finger against the mirror. I would have customers come back to return the movie at the Blockbuster I managed and tell me how taken aback they were when he throws up on his food, or later prey, or when all of his teeth fall out. The biggest thing that I notice now that I didn't before, probably because there was no way it was going to appear in a basic cable showing of this movie, was when he shows off what he calls the Natural History Museum of Seth Brundle. His medicine cabinet is filled with what he used to be. 4 weeks go by and we don't see the day-to-day changes, but Ronnie goes over to talk to him one last time. And as awful as he looks to us, it must be worse for him knowing exactly how his body is changing and fearing what he will become. She wants to terminate their child, and when he overhears this, he kidnaps her from the midnight appointment to have a family together. Or so he says. When they get back, he reveals his plan to have them all go through the teleporter together and become one. His mind has deteriorated as much as his body, and only Stathis can help. He steps in and has his hand and foot melted for his trouble in the first of 8 straight minutes of special effects spectacle. Seth has his jaw ripped off before the big reveal of the titular fly creature, and the horror of Ronnie's face matches our own. When I first saw this thing as an impressionable youth, I was disgusted and elated all in one gasping breath. There are so many different moving parts and gross out effects that it has to be seen multiple times to catch everything. Stathis can avert the teleportation transformation, and Brundlefly becomes one with the very machine that created him, before begging for death with whatever semblance of humanity that he has left. The movie ends without any kind of emotional healing after Ronnie pulls the trigger to end his suffering.
There's a moment later with a shotgun, and just they're so emotionally wrenching what happens. It's not a kill, it's a mercy.
Poor Gina Davis, bless her heart, right?
Anyone at almost any age or time in their life will feel deeply for what the characters are going through. From puberty to pregnancy to a major illness and even just growing older. For a movie that was based on a hard science fiction short story and considered a remake of an atomic age classic, the horror found within is something that wasn't seen before and has yet to be matched since, even by the master of body horror himself.
It's a heartbreaking descent. And that's, when Cronenberg's at his best.
Go see The Fly. It's so good.
On the next episode, an iconic killer makes his return from the grave, but this time he brought a couple jokes along with him. Until next time, gore hounds.
Hi friends, your humble narrator Tyler Nichols here, and I hope that you enjoyed that episode of 80s Horror Memories. If you missed our previous episode, click over here. If you want to see more from our series, click up here. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe right here. And most importantly, stay spooky, folks.